Politics in Britain and in many other countries would be better if politicians concentrated on the things which are most important to people. And the things which are most important to people, when you look at their lives and what happens to them and what they say, involve their health and their well-being and their happiness. Now, it's often not until you actually get later on in life, until you get older, that you realise how important things like health are and how unimportant other things that you might think matter are. Superficial consumption of goods that you think will make you happier turn out to be much less important than those around you and yourself having good health. If politicians realise that these are the things that matter most to most people, and often not what the politicians thought mattered, or what might matter to the politicians and got them into politics in the first place, then politics could be much better than it is. It's only recently that we've begun to realise just how important economic inequality is to happiness and to health. If you look at the World Happiness Survey, which has been published in the last few years, you find that the happiest countries in the world are the most economically equal, affluent countries. So far, we haven't found a country that's become too equal, in that the most equal countries in the world have the highest rates of happiness and the longest lived people, the lowest rates of infant mortality, the better health overall. There appear to be many mechanisms at play that are linking health to economic inequality, and it's hard to work out what they are. It's hard to work out the extent to which people feel devalued when they're paid very little, and that this has an effect on their biology. It's hard to work out whether people cannot access services when they have less, or whether people become more callous when they have too much. And in a country where the elite are taking a much bigger share than in other countries, they care less about the health of people around them. It's not easy to work out exactly what's going on, but it is easy to work out that in more economically equitable countries, people on average are happier and they're healthier. The scientific evidence really matters. If you don't have study after study which is pointing in the same direction, you cannot have any certainty about what you're saying. And it's only when we begin to get study after study suggesting that things we begin to think are true, that we can get any certainty. It's particularly the case when you get new evidence. Something you thought wasn't true appears to be true, and then study after study says that that is happening, that you know you're onto something. The problem for politicians is that they tend to work on gut instincts. They tend to have got interested in politics as a teenager. They tend to join political parties pretty young. They didn't join political parties because they were convinced by evidence. They joined it for another reason. And so when they're later confronted with evidence, if that evidence goes against their core beliefs, often the things that they believed since they were teenagers, they tend to dismiss the evidence. But really annoyingly, they don't tell you they're dismissing it. They don't believe it, but they don't even say that they don't believe it. Brexit is going to be the most interesting thing that's going to be occurring over the next 2 years in the UK. It may well help in some ways. Brexit may help other countries in the European Union work better together. The United Kingdom was a very strange country in the EU. That's partly why it's the first country to try to leave. Greenland has left, but all Greenland's residents are still EU citizens, so it hasn't really left. The UK wasn't a particularly helpful European country. The Conservative Party, its main ally, was a strange party in Poland called the Law and Justice Party that basically didn't play very nicely in Europe. So as the UK tries to leave, the politics of the rest of the continent might well improve. What happens to the UK is entirely unpredictable, but the UK will find out, for instance, whether its real problem was immigration. The UK will find out whether it really can become one of the richest countries in the world on the basis of reverting to being the centre of an empire again. All these kind of fantasies that various politicians have, at least now will be tested out. Whereas without going through this process, we would have had people arguing that immigration was our problem, that being a member of the EU was our problem. Now we may discover that in fact we have other problems and other things that we should have known were our problem, for instance being the most unequal country in Europe, are much more important than many people believed. You could worry that Brexit is a great distraction and will stop politicians doing a good job. However, they were not necessarily doing a good job before Brexit, and they were often arguing about Europe, particularly the Conservative Party. It cut the Conservative Party in half for well over a decade, for 2 decades. This will occupy an enormous amount of parliamentary time and politicians' time. But our politicians were not necessarily doing a very good job of being socially progressive before this point. If you want an analogy, you can go back to the 1950s and think of the Suez Crisis. Now, the Suez Crisis was a terrible distraction. It was seen as a defeat for government. But out of the Suez Crisis and out of Britain realising that it no longer was a very powerful country in the world militarily and it couldn't carry on behaving as it had been behaving before, we got the 1960s, we got incredible social reforms, we got homosexuality made legal, we got the right to abortion, we got far better funded state housing, we got far better benefits for people who are poor, we got schools being made far more equal than they'd been made before. And you could argue that none of that would have happened without the Suez Crisis. We'd have rumbled on in the same way we were going before.